What was the biggest bluff in history? Operation Mincemeat was pretty neat. UK intelligence dropped a dead supposed pilot off the Spanish coast with false information that the Allies were going to invade Greece, not Sicily. So convinced were the Nazis that, when the Allies actually invaded Sicily, it was quickly overcome and served as a launching pad for the liberation of Greece. The ghost army used by the US Army in World War II. Basically, they used inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and fake radio transmissions to stage more than 20 battlefield deceptions, often operating very close to the front lines. They used inflatable tanks, cannons, jeeps, trucks, and airplanes that the men would inflate with air compressors, and then camouflage imperfectly so that enemy air reconnaissance could see them. They could create dummy airfields, troop bivouacs, complete with fake laundry hanging out on clotheslines, motor pools, artillery batteries, and tank formations in a few hours. Many of the men in this unit were artists, recruited from New York and Philadelphia art schools. Columbus and the 1504 eclipse. On his fourth voyage, Columbus found himself stranded in Jamaica. The locals were initially cooperative, but after a year or so got sick of Columbus' crew's Dutchbaggery and basically wanted them gone. Columbus had a star almanac with him and noticed a lunar eclipse coming up. So he called the natives together and told them that his god was mad they had started to become so inhospitable and was going to take the moon out of the sky. Sure enough, when night came, the moon slowly turned red, and everyone begged Chris to make it stop. He said he had to go pray about the whole thing, and locked himself in his cabin with an hourglass waiting until he knew the moon would be coming out of the shadow. Came out and basically said, okay, God says he'll bring the moon back if you start supplying us again. Which they did. I wonder how different things would have been today if the natives didn't buy it. My God made the moon disappear. Listen, we may be natives, but we know about fucking lunar eclipses. During the opening years of the Japanese Sengoku Jidai, a small clan, the Matsudaira, offer themselves as vassals to the more powerful Imagawa clan for protection. The deal requires the Matsudaira heir to live as a hostage of the Imagawa, but their mutual enemy, the Oda, kidnap him and threaten to kill the boy unless the two clans end their alliance. The lord of the Matsudaira's response was, do it. He said that if the Oda killed his son, he would still remain allied to the Imagawa. Losing his only heir would prove to his new allies how committed he was toward them. The Oda believed him and sit on the boy for a few years until he is finally rescued and ends up living a long and prosperous life under his more well-known name, Tokugawa Ieyasu. The capture of Fort Detroit in the War of 1812. British General Brock took the fort, 582 regulars and 1,600 militiamen, with a minimal force, 50 regulars, 250 volunteers, and 200 natives, by shelling the walls, screaming, and continuously marched their men around to make it appear as though they had a force of several thousand regulars and natives. The British continued to support this by sending a letter they knew would be intercepted by the Americans that asked for no more natives be allowed into the area, as there were already 5,000 there. All of these mind games made American General Hull believe he was facing a superior force, and he surrendered the fort to them without a fight. Letter Brock wrote to the American commander, General William Hull. Sir, it is far from my inclination to join a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences. Maybe I missed it, but I'm partial to Gen H. Norman Schwarzkopf's deception of the Iraqi military during Operation Desert Storm. Essentially, the U.S. intelligence community had reason to believe top Iraqi leadership watched CNN and took it as gospel. The U.S. set up a large amphibious landing demonstration, which they let press attend. Iraqi leadership saw this as CNN presented. They understood this as a rehearsal for the coalition's plan. To cement the thought process, the U.S. dropped leaflets depicting death from the sea. Saddam then reorganized his troops along the coast for the inevitable attack. This allowed for the left hook from Saudi Arabia, causing the destruction of the third biggest military in the world in a matter of days. Did anyone mention Vlad Dracula? Despite only having a relatively small army, by using psychological warfare, he was able to fend off or avoid war with the Ottoman Empire. Edit. I say psychological warfare because even though he did defeat some enemies, he bluffed the Ottoman Empire by lining a field with spiked enemies, making it appear that Vlad was more dangerous than he actually was, when in fact he was greatly outnumbered, and if the Ottomans weren't so thrown off by the display, they probably would have wiped Vlad and his people off. Spearing people from the anus to the mouth and hanging them like grisly yard ornaments is pretty good psychological warfare. I'm gonna murder some people isn't really a bluff when you've got dead guys all over the place. 1775, just outside Boston. Washington takes high ground known as Dorchester Heights and fortifies it. Benedict Arnold had just captured the Fort Ticonderoga and its large supply of cannons. Over horrible terrain, the Continental Army was able to get these cannons to Washington. Unfortunately, Washington had neither the powder nor the shot to actually do much with his cannons. It didn't matter. The British commander of Boston didn't want to risk losing his ships to the cannons and didn't want a repeat of Bunker Hill. So he retreated. Matt Stafford has the Lions at the 1-yard line with time running out and gets up to spike the ball to stop the clock. All the other players on both teams just stand up, assuming that's what he was going to do. Instead, Stafford just takes the ball and walks into the end zone. Touchdown, game over, Lions win. Genghis Khan did a good bluff. Under the siege of a Chinese fortress, he announced that he would end his siege in exchange for a gift of 1,000 cats and 10,000 swallows. The fortress commander gratefully complied. After the animals arrived in the Mongol camp, Genghis Khan ordered his men to tie a small cotton wool tuft to the tail of each creature, then set the tuft afire. When the panicked and frightened animals were turned loose, they made directly for their nests and lairs and igniting hundreds of small fires. While the defenders were preoccupied with putting out fires, Genghis Khan's warriors stormed the city in conquest. I remember hearing a story once in history class about a medieval ruler whose castle was under siege. The siege had been going on for a long time, and they were just about out of food and would have had to surrender. They had one cow left alive, and they decided to do the one thing that may break the siege. They catapulted the cow over the wall. Then, they stood on the top of the wall yelling, "We have so much food, we can throw cows over the walls." The enemy was so demoralized that they left, and that's how that castle survived the siege. Certainly not the biggest in history, or the biggest in anything for that matter, but an interesting bit of trivia in history that most people don't know. Newburgh, Indiana, a little town right on the Ohio River in southwestern Indiana, was the only first town north of the Mason-Dixon line to be captured by the Confederates during the Civil War. The small group of raiding Confederate soldiers crossed the river from Kentucky and carried stovepipes to look like cannons, and it worked. They occupied the town for a couple hours. If I remember correctly, it's been years since I read the details. No shots were fired, no loss of life, but I believe they did take some supplies. My grandma used to work for IBM as a programmer. She told me this story once. There was a project commissioned to them by the Corps of Engineers to write a program that would check the water levels, flow rate, and similar pieces of information from all of the dams on the Columbia River. The best programmer my grandma knew was the lead on the project, and when it was finished, the Corps of Engineers said it was no good, that the program ran too fast, and there was no way the data could be accurate. So my grandma said that this programmer just put a bunch of for loops in the code to make it run quite a bit slower. Then gave it back, and the Corps of Engineers said it was perfect. Every few years, they would be asked to revise the code to see if they could make it faster, and this guy would just reduce the number of iterations on each loop. User Turborg referred to the photo reconnaissance dummy armies of WW2, one of two things I came here to mention. The other is the Pas-de-Calais invasion. Allied forces took advantage of the temporary disgrace of General George S. Patton after an incident in his camp to send him on observation missions and tours that were deliberately not secret enough. German intelligence believed, as was intended, that a genuinely talented general would not be excluded from the invasion plans, and as such the Normandy landings were a distraction. They concentrated their forces way north of the invasion that was in progress, awaiting a second landing by a ghost army that would never come. This probably saved tens of thousands of lives on both sides and equal numbers of French civilians by reducing the scale of the initial conflicts. One particular time, in the Great Siege of Malta, around 4,000 Ottomans were going to charge our old, poorly fortified city of Medina. All the people living in Medina at the time, around 200, went up on the walls with around 40 knights and other mercenaries and formed a line. They got with them a statue of Saint Mary and started praying. The Ottomans got scared when they saw a file of people on the walls as they thought the city was heavily fortified. They could not see that half of those people were peasants, children, and women because of the sun shining on the wall from the back, so they retreated. Maltese people considered the event a miracle by Saint Mary, because if the Ottomans didn't retreat, they would all have been killed. It's an unknowing bluff, but was one vital turning point amongst many other ones in the victory against the Ottomans and the halting of their invasion across the Mediterranean in 1560s. There's always the donation of Constantine. So, way back in the 8th century, a document was forged. This document was a forgery of a Roman imperial decree, in which the Emperor Constantine had supposedly given the See of Peter, the bishopric of Rome, supremacy over the 4 other principal sees of Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople. In addition, he gave the church land in across the empire, which included Rome itself and basically all of the land in the Western Roman Empire. This document was used multiple times to get Charlemagne to bow to the authority of the church, or in the great pissing contest between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope in Rome. The document was widely believed to be true until the mid-15th century, when people began to wise up and realize that this ridiculous piece of paper could not possibly be real. Napoleon marching into Austria, his men couldn't get across a bridge. So he had his officers cross the bridge laughing and joking and had then tell the Austrian army on the other side that a treaty had been signed. The Austrians believed them due to a lack of communication and allowed the army to cross. Napoleon's army then encircled and captured the Austrians' army. I'm not sure of all of these details, but feel free to research and correct my mistakes. It's what I remember from AP European history. It was a town, not a castle, I believe. Zhuge Liang ordered all the gates to be opened and instructed soldiers disguised as civilians to sweep the roads while he sat on the viewing platform above the gates with 2 boys flanking him. He put on a calm and composed image by playing his guqin. When the Wei army led by Sima Yi arrived, Sima was surprised by the scene before him, and he ordered a retreat after suspecting that there was an ambush inside the city. Zhuge Liang later explained that his strategy was a risky one. It worked because Zhuge Liang had a reputation for being a careful military tactician who hardly took risks. So Sima, he came to the conclusion that there was an ambush upon seeing Zhuge's relaxed composure. Isn't it amazing the energy, charisma, poise, and disregard for risk we have in our 20s to pull off something like this? I'm not saying I could fake out IBM and find a diamond in the rough like DOS, but I feel like I had much better odds of taking professional chances in my 20s than I do now. I think the entrepreneur ceased to exist a few years back. You could also point out the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was a supposed plan to design lasers that could shoot down nuclear missiles from space. It was a very preposterous plan, but that was the point. The US intended it as a bluff to make the Soviets want to accomplish the technology before the US did. In effect, the Soviet Union wasted a lot of time and resources which only quickened their collapse. Tokugawa Ieyasu, Duchan, Japan, January 31st, 1543 to June 1st, 1616, was the founder and first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, which virtually ruled Japan from the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Ieyasu seized power in 1600, received appointment as shogun in 1603, abdicated from office in 1605, but remained in power until his death in 1616. His given name is sometimes spelled Ieyasu, 2 according to the historical pronunciation of he. Ieyasu was posthumously enshrined at Nikko Tashogu with the name Tasho Dagongan, Dongjal Dachen Shan. Sorry, I don't mean to argue here, but what is this supposed to achieve? Are they banking on the besieger thinking, whoops, they still have food? Let's go home. Edit. Thanks for the answers, people. I forgot that the attrition goes both ways, and the besiegers are running on scarcity as much as the town/castle residents are. I believe so. Remember, a sieging army also needs a lot of food and water. If the army is close to running out, and they see the people they're sieging aren't, they might just leave. This is also a Croatian folktale. The story goes that the Turks were surprised by the resistance when they tried to conquer the fort of Đurđevac, and their leader, Ulama Beg, opted for a long-term sieging tactic to starve out the defenders. After a while, food really did run out in the fort, except for a single chicken that was hidden by an old lady. When it was discovered, the defenders obviously wanted to eat it, but the old lady convinced their leader to instead put it in a cannon and fire it at the surrounding Turks. Dismayed that the Croats had enough food to fuck around like that, they left, cursing the Croats for chickens. First, Admiral Akbar was already dead by this time. What makes you so sure? Star Wars might be set a long time ago, but the Three Kingdoms era was a long time ago too. For all we know, Akbar and Zhuge Liang were contemporaries. Second, Admiral Akbar didn't warn people of traps. By the time he said it's a trap, they were all already in the trap. You don't understand. Admiral Akbar's mere presence is a surefire indication that you are about to step into a trap. If Admiral Akbar is with you, then you are about to be trapped. Our current evidence indicates that military engagements where Admiral Akbar was present turned out to be a trap 100% of the time. I admit that this is only one engagement, but still. Admiral Akbar himself gets trapped 6 or 7 times on his way to work every morning. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.